May I ask how many people have read Innocent so far? Half?
Yeah, third.
How many have read Presumed Innocent?
Or seen the movie? We got them covered. At least they know who the characters are, some of them.
First off, I'll say, so everyone knows what I'm doing here, I worked with Scott on one of the books he wrote called Personal Injuries, and it's only been 10 years, and so far I haven't cracked it. But it was a good lesson. I was just talking with him in the waiting room there that this book would have been maybe easier, for me at least, to make work in a film because it concentrates on a half a dozen characters, and Personal Injuries was more varied. And I thought when I purchased the book that, oh, I can cherry pick this book and just pick out the best parts of it and make it work. And really, it's not easy to do that with 400 plus pages. Anyway, I'll just say that for an actor, I don't think you can ask for anything more than the characters that Scott writes in the books that I've read, and certainly including Innocent. It's just wonderful layered stuff for an actor.
Thank you. But I have to say, I have to tell one story. The development on Personal Injuries went on for a while, as development tends to do in this city. And eventually, I had another novel called Reversible Errors that was made into a wonderful miniseries by my friend Mike Robe, who was sitting here. And when we were talking about who was going to write the teleplay for this, Mike said to me, he says, well, you know, the first candidate is somebody I'm sure you know. And he gave me the name, and I said, oh, I never heard of that guy. He says, well, it says right here in his top credit is that he wrote the screenplay for Personal Injuries. There had been so many successors that I had totally forgotten this young man. It was...
What was his name?
I don't remember.
Probably about 9 or 10 writers. Anyway, one of the things I can't, because certainly one doesn't want to ruin this book for those who haven't read it or haven't finished it, but one of the things this book does, which is, I think, and I'm not a critic, God knows, but very successfully does, and I think was a gamble and worth talking about, because we didn't really talk about much in the green room, is that he decided to go back and forth in time, and also in terms of how certain characters perceive how that time, that's not the right way to say it, but how each character saw that period of time. And I guess the first question I would ask is, when you first thought of the book, did you think of it in a linear fashion?
The nature of my mind is that I seldom think in linear fashion. And that's not only self-deprecating, it's also true. Innocent begins with a prologue in which Nat Sabich, Rusty and Barbara Sabich's son, relates that his mother has been found dead next to his father. And the novel then goes... In bed. Man is sitting in a bed in which the dead body of a woman lies. That was my first note. So, and the novel then goes in two directions. It goes forward from that moment through the eyes of the prosecutor, Tommy Molto, character from Presumed Innocent, and backwards from Rusty's eyes to explain the events that led up to that moment. Now, you know, I started with a man is sitting on a bed in which the dead body of a woman lies. I worked this through in my own head, you know, after the Post-it note sat on my desk for months.
So are you saying, like, you woke up one morning and just had that thought, a man is sitting on a bed with his wife dead next to him?
The answer...
It's written in the wind.
Well, it turns out there is an Edward Hopper painting called Excursion into Philosophy, in which a man is sitting on a bed and behind him, with her back to him, is a woman half clothed. The man is sitting on the bed, clearly abject. He's got a book next to him. I think there may be a pen, so that you assume he's been taking notes of some kind. And like all Hopper paintings, it's amazing. And in this particular case, because her posture sort of suggests that it's a post-coital moment, the usual Hopper sense of isolation is even more powerful. You know, the sort of narrative of the painting is that, you know, whatever intimacy they've had has not saved this guy from his sense of isolation. So here's the problem. I can remember seeing lots of Hopper paintings. I do not remember having seen that painting. But clearly, it's been on the road. It's part of an exhibit that was originally mounted at the Tate. I assume I saw it in London several years ago. And then by the usual process of, you know, whatever it is, dreams or whatever, this woman who was, you know, presumably asleep, sort of, you know, sacked out after sex, was transformed by my, you know, naughty little imagination into somebody who was dead. And this image, without any
orgasm.
Without any under. That's right.
I don't know how long this goes, but certainly we're here until the end of the war. But maybe the best thing to do is to just have you ask questions, because I can't decide, you know, should we talk about the book, should we talk about his work, should we talk about how the writer functions, and specifically this writer. So maybe we should just open it up and it'll be more fruitful that way. No? Okay.
How many films have you been in based on novels?
Me?
You.
Good question. Graduate was a novel.
Right.
Midnight Cowboy was a novel. Straw Dogs was actually a novel by another name. Little Big Man was a wonderful novel.
Yeah, Thomas Berger, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and I thought underappreciated that year. I think Catch-22 got all the action, which is also wonderful. All the President's Men, Kramer versus Kramer. Anybody? I can't. Marathon Man, yes.
So
Boy.
I know what how a novelist looks at the process of turning a novel into film. But I don't think I've ever heard an actor talk about it. I've heard directors talk about it, but I've never heard actors talk about it. And you were clearly aware of the underlying material.
I mean, it's not the actor's problem until I ran afoul and purchased your book, Personal Injuries. But it's not the problem to, you know, condense that. In fact, I'm just learning. I'm always trying to learn. And I know that this book, before I answer your question, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Yeah.
And I know they made a movie out of it, and then there was the book. So I said, okay, and I read the book and immediately went to see a movie just to see how because I heard the movie worked, and I think it did. And what they did was they just decided they're going to take all the sexual activity of the protagonist, the male, out. And because there was like 2 or 3 affairs he was having in the book, and they just went out. So they just made that decision, and then it was, you know, a good half of the book probably. Anyway, for me, I was spoiled because I did The Graduate, and then I did Midnight Cowboy, and I had come from the theater, and meaning, not that I could get jobs in the theater, but I read plays, and I wanted to be a stage actor, as all my friends did. We didn't think we had a chance in the movies in those days. It was Tab Hunter Ruck, and it was a whole different period of time. And plays meant that you could do the scenes that you wanted to do, even if you didn't have a job off-Broadway or off-Broadway. So you did the greats. You did Chekhov, and you did Pinter, and you did Miller, and you did Tennessee Williams, and you did that golden period of time. That's what you were accustomed to reading and to kind of trying to get your characters from, even if you were just doing a scene in class. So that when the movie thing happened to me, I just assumed that's the way movies are, because I hadn't really gotten movie scripts. And The Graduate, yes, had a very layered character, as did Midnight Cowboy. And then suddenly after that, and Little Big Man, but then there were scripts being offered. And particularly after The Graduate, there were a lot of scripts offered to me for about a year. And I said, I'm not doing any of these, because they were thin. They were screenplays. They were original screenplays. And next to novels, there's nothing layered about them. And I thought it was weakly written. And so I said, well, I'm going back to the theater. And it was easy in those days to talk like that, because it was the days of the Beat Generation and Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg, and really to have a job meant you were selling out. And so, you know, it was not hard to want to be an artist. And so there was like a year and a half between Graduate and Midnight Cowboy. Basically what I'm saying is that a book gives you the layers, and in a screenplay you have to make it up, and if you don't have the right director, that doesn't happen. There's also no rehearsal. I did have it in The Graduate, I did have it in Midnight Cowboy, but there's no rehearsal, and for good reason from their point of view, because they have to hire the director, the cinematographer, all those people, and they don't want them on salary, editor, while you're, as a director, in there helping the actors find their characters. So you come in the first day of work, basically. You could have had a couple dinners with the director or whatever, and you just, you know, you're flying by the seat of your pants. And unlike a play you can develop a character, because the audience is just seeing it once, presumably. You know, so many actors always say, when we used to, you know, they'd, oh, I hear you're in that play, congratulations. And the actor would say, don't come the first week, wait 5 weeks. So you can't do that. You can develop the character. You can't do that in a movie, because it's not going to match. You know, you have suddenly found the character in the 5th week of shooting, and the director says no. Anyways, that's the long answer.
Graduate was written by a guy named Webb?
Charles Webb.
Okay. And did you read that book?
Yes. I can't remember if I read the screenplay or the book first, but I was turning out to be an interview with me. I wanted to be about you. Very quickly, I really thought it was a dirty trick that they were foisting on me by even asking me to try out for The Graduate, because character's name was Benjamin Braddock, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant from Boston, 6 feet tall, blue eyes. That's what was written in the book, debating squad. You know, it was Robert Redford, basically. And I declined, because that was the arrogance, that was the conceit that we had in those times. I don't need this. I want to be, you know, fuck this. I want to be an artist, you know. And I guess that so made Nichols curious that he called me, and he said, so you don't think, no, of course I'm not right for this. He says, you mean you're Jewish? That's the way he talked. I said, yes. And he said, he says, well, who do you think is right for it? And I remember that on the coffee table, I was living on 11th Street, there was a copy of Time magazine, 1967. And there was The Man of the Year was on the cover. And the Man of the Year that year was youth under 25. Okay, look at that. There's people here that remember that. Because that was the majority of the population, I guess, the good part. And so it was like a drawing of a man, and he was Robert Redford or Benjamin Braddock. He was everything I wasn't. And I said, if you look at Time magazine, Mr. Nichols, you'll see who that character's like. And he said, did you think it was funny, the book and the script? I said, yes, very much. He says, well, maybe he's Jewish inside. And we went on from there. But back to you. I think the first book you wrote was 1L.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, my wife is here tonight, and one of our dear friends who grew up with our kids has just been admitted to law school in San Diego, and we're all very excited for him. We're going to take him out. And my first thought was, I'm going to give him 1L to read, which means it's the first year of law school, and it's a quite wonderful book, I think, that stands the test of time in terms of what that can be like.
I'm actually writing a new introduction for it, and the book has been in print so long that this is the second time that I've written a new introduction. So.
May I ask you some personal questions?
Of course, why not? We're among friends.
You're growing up in Chicago,
Yeah,
and at
North Side,
Pardon me?
the North Side.
Meaning,
I grew up at Sherwin and Albany in West Rogers Park. But the North Side of Chicago really means, colloquially, north of Madison Street. But really, when you would talk about Lincoln Park if it was nearer to the center of the city. So it means beyond that.
middle class?
Well, it was interesting. It was an almost completely Jewish neighborhood. And that was what distinguished the neighborhood, was that everybody was Jewish. So my best friend's father laid floors. He owned his own tile-laying business. My dad was a doctor. On the block that I lived on, where the houses were a little bit bigger, there were 3 doctors. But, there were people who did, very middle-class kinds of jobs, like my friend whose father was a tile layer. So I think of it as a middle-class to upper-middle-class neighborhood in the days when you said upper middle class, you still meant fundamentally middle class. I mean, upper middle class has become a euphemism in this country in the last 30 years for people who don't want to admit that they're actually upper class. So I'm upper class, but I don't want to be.
Is your first ambition, when you start thinking about what you want to be, is it a writer or a criminal lawyer, which you've been for 30 years?
No. My household was, my dad's a doctor. My dad has lost his mother when he's 4 years old. My father was a great doctor and not as good a father. And he just cut through a lot of stuff.
It's all in the book.
My father treated his children as rivals because he was so hungry for my mother's attention. And of course, that's not a fair fight, a grown-up versus a child. And because of that, although both my parents thought it would be wonderful if I were to become a doctor like my father, I guess had this sort of subterranean strategy of divide and conquer. My mother always dreamt of being a novelist. She didn't get very far with that, but I loved my mother. She's still among us, and I'm grateful for that, and I adored her as a child. And
She basically a mother?
She was a mother. She was a mother at home, former teacher, wanted to write, couldn't make herself do it in the way that so many people who want to write, can't just cut through all their other responsibilities to find time to do it. I might just have answered why I wrote on the morning commuter train, but that I'm getting
Who was
ahead of
the
myself.
first person that said to you, you can write?
Oh, boy.
Did it happen when you were in elementary school, or?
I pursued this dream sort of single-mindedly of being a novelist. And when I was a senior at Amherst College,
She's available.
when I got to Amherst, there was no such thing as creative writing. It was regarded as the equivalent of teaching basket weaving. And there were a number of students, most of whom have gone on to actually great careers in this city, like, my classmates, Henry Brummel and Bob Nathan and David Black. But we all thought of ourselves as would-be novelists in those days. And we sort of, in a phrase of the times, mau-mau'd the faculty into hiring a writer so that we could have some kind of teaching of writing. And the writer who was hired, actually the second writer who was hired, was a great prose writer named Tilly Olson.
Oh.
And, for those of you who do not know Tilly Olson's work, it stands among the great short fiction written during the 20th century. Her story, Tell Me a Riddle, really, along with The Bear, is probably the best novella written in the 20th century. So Tilly shows up, and I knew who Tilly was. I'd read her work long before, and it was Tilly who said to me, you have that stuff. And when at the end of my senior year she inscribed a book to me that said, for Scott, and what was it? Descendant of the true family of writers. That was the confirmation that I'd always longed for.
Well, then the big question is, you put that to rest and went to law school.
Not at first. Oh, it's a longer story than that, Hoffman. Oh, from Amherst, I went to Stanford and was a writing fellow there in the Stegner program.
What's a writing fellow?
It means they support you.
Oh.
They, basically pay your bills and say you're young, you're talented, go write. And I was surrounded by a lot of brilliant young writers. Some of them are names people know, like Raymond Carver and Alice Hoffman and Richard Price. Some of them are names you don't know. And that's just purely a matter of, how life turns out and how people get over themselves. But there was, a lot of brilliant young
How people
writers.
get over themselves, meaning enough rejection stops some people.
Yeah, rejection stops people, particularly in our age group. Drugs and alcohol stopped people. Ray Carver, frankly, when I knew him, was mostly just a drunk who had written some good stories, but who would never have accomplished what he accomplished had he not stopped drinking. And others, who there was somebody at Stanford when I was at Stanford who made the most brilliant start on a career of any writer that I have been aware of in my lifetime. As a 19-year-old undergraduate, was publishing in The Atlantic and Rolling Stone and everywhere, and was subdued by, alcohol and cocaine. He lived through it. He's clean and sober now, but what he could have accomplished creatively somehow was lost in those years of dependency and then recovery.
Before we go to questions, and please raise your hands this time.
You mean before I interrupt again?
What was, I'm just curious, I have two questions. What were the first books that you read that, even if you're a kid, I remember reading Moby Dick when I was 16 years old, that kind of thing that hit you?
The first book that really transported me that way was The Count of Monte Cristo. Sword fighting, costumes, and long-nurtured revenge. And I remember it not because it was the first book that I had loved, because in my house, I was 11 then. In my house, like many of the houses of the people who sit here, my mother always read to my sister and me. And you can't imagine until life goes on what an extraordinary gift you're being given when you're read to as a child. But the reason that book stayed with me is because when I read it, for some reason, when I finished it, I thought, wow, how wonderful would it be to write something that thrilled somebody else the way this book thrilled me. I don't know why.
You remember that thought when you were...
I remember that thought.
Parenthetically, my father-in-law, obviously my wife's father, has always been the perfect barometer in terms of if movies are going to be a success or not throughout the years, because he goes to see everything. And if he doesn't like a picture, they don't need previews, they don't need cards, they just have to ask Billy. It doesn't succeed. And when Robin Hood came out, I said, "How'd you like it?" He says, "No." And I said, "Why not?" He says, "He wasn't wearing tights." Questions, please.
Wait a minute, before you get up,
Yes.
I got to tell one story. Just because it fits in. You mentioned Moby Dick.
Yes.
And my grandmother was a Russian Jewish immigrant, came to this country with probably 7th grade education. But when I think about, my own love of literature, which was passed down from my mother, it really was nurtured in her by her mother. And my grandmother read principally in Yiddish, but when she was 70 years old, she decided that she had to read this book called Moby Dick because she'd heard a lot about it. And the copy was at my parents' house. For whatever reason, she didn't take it home. She only read it when she was at my parents' house. And it was in the days when, air conditioning had just begun to be installed in homes. And so my grandmother, like a lot of people of her age, would sit in a shawl in the air conditioning. And my friends saw my grandmother sitting in the den periodically with Moby Dick in her hands. And finally, my best friend, the son of the tile layer, Steve Shannon, stops and he says, "Mrs. Pastron," he says, all the time, he says, "I'm coming in here in the den and you're reading this book, Moby Dick. What's it about?" And she looks at him, she says, "A fish."
I have a vivid, my brother went to Korea, so his friend took over being my big brother. There's only 2 of us, and he introduced me to reading, and I have this vivid memory of reading Moby Dick, and it was hard reading.
It's a hard book.
It was, and there's a lot of technical stuff about whaling and everything, but I come to this chapter about the cook. What is his name? I can't, it's on the tip of my, but the cooks had a name, obviously, and when they caught a whale, they tied it to the side of the boat, and the sharks would come and eat at it before they could get it back, the boat back to docks. So they'd wind up with, a skeletal. And Stubb was a cook's name. And there's this scene of him leaning over the side of the ship. He's black. I don't know if he's Afro-American, whatever, but he's leaning over and Melville's trying to write in the vernacular the way he's talking, and he's preaching to the sharks to stop eating the whale. And he's saying, I remember the lines, he's saying, stop that damn smacking of the lips. And I just burst out laughing. And I didn't realize that I am being introduced to literature. I am actually laughing out loud, at a classic. Please ask some questions. We'll have to, I have a hunch, I'm always a believer in mystery, and we never mentioned this, but where was your grandmother from in Russia?
Oh, somewhere between Minsk and Pinsk, the old...
My parents were from Kiev, that's why I'm asking. There's always some bloodline.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, for God's sake, for being the first one.
A few years ago, I was doing this kind of thing with a good friend of Ted's and mine, Dave Barry. And I had just written a book about capital punishment, and I thought, how in the world am I going to sit there with Dave Barry and talk about capital punishment?
The name of the book?
My book was called Ultimate Punishment.
Okay.
So, but of course Dave had the answer. He stood up, he talked, he made everybody laugh like hell, and then he turned to me and said, okay, now you can talk about capital punishment. You can be the big downer. I became, over the years, an opponent of capital punishment. I started out against it, of course, as a college student, became a prosecutor and began to feel, if not in favor of it, certainly as a prosecutor, I could stand up and ask for the death penalty, something I never had to do because I was a federal prosecutor when there was still no federal death penalty. But I was quite divided about it even after I began to represent death row inmates. And eventually I was appointed by the first of our governors who's in the penitentiary at the moment.
Chicago.
Yeah. Well, we're about to adopt a new state motto, Illinois, where our governors make our license plates. So, but anyway, George Ryan, notwithstanding his malefactions while Secretary of State, was actually a great governor and declared a moratorium on executions and appointed 14 citizens to study the death penalty and make recommendations for reform. And the reforms ultimately, many of them were ultimately implemented through the pretty courageous actions of a young state legislator named Barack Obama. But anyway, in the course of sitting on that commission, I realized that I had always been asking myself the wrong question about the death penalty. And I think it's a mistake that most Americans make. Most Americans think to themselves, is there a case out there? Have I heard of a case that's so awful that I would put that son of a bitch to death? And I still confess that there are cases that I hear about where, I understand and feel myself intense retributive instincts. That's not the right question. The right question is a lawyer's question. Can we ever construct a capital system that reaches only the right cases, which is those cases that, just fill us with fury, without also sweeping in the wrong cases? And the wrong cases, by definition, are the cases of people who are innocent. That's a horror if you send an innocent person to his or her death, or cases which, by any relative sense of moral gravity, just don't equate with other cases for which the death penalty is being imposed. And when you ask the right question, will we ever, in essence, design a just capital punishment system, that you realize that this is a debate that ought not continue? Because the answer to that question is unequivocally no. And the reason it's important is because when you cut through all of the arguments, the reason Americans want a death penalty is not because it's a deterrent, because it isn't, or not because we need it in a society where supermax confinement exists. We don't even do it for the victims, because the truth of the matter is we don't let victims decide the punishment, not only in routine crimes, but even in most murder cases. We need a death penalty, most people think, because it captures a sense of moral proportion. The formulation basically is for ultimate evil, for crimes that are so far beyond the boundaries of what we can tolerate as human, there has to be an ultimate punishment. So if that's the goal, which is to preserve a sense of moral order, then it very much matters whether or not the death penalty is being imposed only on the right cases, because that's the assumption. If you ask Americans, do you want a death penalty at the expense of executing an innocent person every now and then, they overwhelmingly say no. They want you to design a system that doesn't do that, and you'll never do it.
But what is your feeling about money? If you got enough money,
the saying goes, there ain't no rich men on death row, and it's true.
That strikes me as quite relevant. The questioner, do you have a reason for asking?
Only that I'm opposed to the death penalty, and I want to hear opposition to capital punishment voiced and clarified. And I thank you for that clarifying comment.
You know, I have a very good friend, a lawyer, friend of mine, and he, for many, many years now, and I don't think he's ever lost a case. I once got in a discussion which ultimately resulted in an argument about capital punishment, and I was against capital punishment, and he was for capital punishment, and it finally reached a heated moment, and I said, I don't understand, you're a bright guy, how can you feel that way? And he says, you want me to take the other side? And I thought of that story after I finished reading your book, because he does that in his book, he takes both sides. Yes, sir.
By the way, if anybody wants to ask about innocent, feel free.
I'm sorry, that's not my topic. I'm more interested in the writer in you than the product that you produced. You talked about your time at Stanford and the internship, and almost made it sound that certainly some writers, I don't need to say you yet, it was serendipitous that they became successful. You talked about the ones who didn't make it, and is that true? Is it fate? Is it serendipity? And the second part of the question is, writers are unusual people. I was with one the other night, and we were talking about the world we live in today with an internet and digital publication, and everybody's published now. Not everybody makes any money at it, but everybody's published. And his assertion was that, yes, not everybody is going to make it, that's a serendipity, but writers really want to be read more than they want to be compensated for their work. Can you comment on both those things, the serendipity of becoming a good writer, and whether or not you really want to see it published and read, or make a buck at it?
Are you a writer?
No, sir.
Well, I mean, I think the serendipity point is something that Dustin can talk about. I've always been fascinated by a story which I think is true, that you lived in New York with Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall at one point.
Much older than me.
But
Yes, true.
But yes, I do believe that there's an enormous amount of serendipity in who makes it. I don't think there are a lot of no-talent bums who succeed in any of the arts. I wasn't trying to imply that. I just think there are three ingredients to a successful career in the arts. One, unfortunately, is talent. Another is perseverance, which in the arts is easier said than done, because most people spend a lot of time getting knocked down, and many of them just eventually just don't get back up again. They say it's not worth it. They go to work in their father's coat factory. And the third is luck. You know, presumed innocent changed my life, but I would have written that book whether or not America was in the midst of this immense thrall, and just the beginning of it, actually, rather than the midst of this thrall with lawyers. And, you know, that made me.
You wrote how many books before that?
Oh, I had 4 or 5 unpublished novels by the time Presumed Innocent was published. I learned a lot from each of them, but the truth is Presumed Innocent, you know, was the best of those books.
And if that hadn't happened, you still would have your day job as a criminal lawyer, and presumably you'd still be writing.
I don't think, you know, I remember looking at my ex-wife and saying, if this book doesn't get published, I'm never going to write another novel. And she just shook her head. You know, no, it's, you know, that wasn't true. I was going to write another novel. So now, you must have you must have known people when you were working in the theater who just seemed to you loaded with talent.
when you talked about writing, it equated the same with acting. There's no difference in any of the arts, I don't think. I always say the same thing when I'm asked by students, if I'm speaking, don't go into this if you're going into it to make it, or you're going into to be able to make a living at it. That is it'll kill you. And that's not why I was in it. That's not why Gene Hackman was in it. That's not why Duval was in it. That was what we wanted to do, even though we couldn't get work. And our measure of success was, can we make a living out of this? Maybe one day we'll wind up being able to afford an apartment on West End Avenue. But that was really all it was. It was to be able to, that's the worst part about acting, and I always thought that writing is a much easier thing, because you get up in the morning and write. Painter can paint, a writer, a composer can compose. An actor needs a job. That's why they always
An actor needs somebody else's permission.
Yes, and you need an audience. That's what acting class, many times, is a bunch of actors being an audience for the actor that's doing an exercise, because there's no subsidized theater. But and what buoyed us on was the awareness that talent doesn't necessarily mean anything, because we did try to learn about the other arts, and we learned about Charles Ives, or I did at least, this great composer who really kind of tilted the axis of what modern music was all about. Not only didn't make it, but never heard an orchestra perform his symphonies. Died, and they found a trunkload of his material. I mean, there was...
Emily Dickinson.
Huh?
Emily Dickinson,
Which is
return
what?
to Amherst. Barely published or recognized in her lifetime, and my candidate for the great American poet. Now, can I answer one, can I go back to one question? Because I have to put on my hat now as president of the Authors Guild. And I want to address the point that authors want to be read rather than make money. I think that is true for first-time authors. It is not true for fifth or sixth-time authors. And once people experience the thrill of being published and find out, that it's not the transformative experience that they expected, but instead they've got to go back and write another book because it's not really the publication that they're in it for, just like the acting. It's the writing that's really calling to them. Once they learn that, then they confront what Dustin was talking about. You have to make a living at it. You cannot go on doing it unless you can make a living at it, or you do what I did once I went to law school, which is, I rode on the morning commuter train. So the arguments that, we can absolutely minimize authors' incomes because they'll always write, yeah, we'll have first-time authors, we won't have fifth-time authors that way.
I know it's very uneasy to sit in an audience and to look at two people on the stage who happen to be successful, and it's very easy for us to say that. But I have to tell you, it's one of the few truths that I have been a commonality, if that's the right word, for since I began to study acting. I mean, I directed community theater, and to this day, it's one of the richest, or the few plays that I did, some in New York, some in New Jersey, some in North Dakota, and community theater means non-professional actors. It was some of the richest experiences I've ever had. And I really do know in my heart of hearts that I would like to think if the House on American Activity, perked up once more and I had to make a decision as to whether to sell out, my fellow men and women, or to take that, shot and suddenly be blacklisted, which some of them were. Yes, I would like to think I would and could do it, because I could direct community theater. They couldn't stop me from doing something that I loved. It certainly wouldn't be easy, but the question is how many of us are able to find our passion, and that becomes richer and more important to us than being famous. And I talk to people, and you segue, you start out doing this and you segue buddy, a woman just said to me recently, I work with children's theater, and it's a rich experience for her. And I know how rich that can be because when my kids were young, we took them to children's theater, and I watched and I observed, the directors of the kids on stage. I mean, it's that there's no substitute for that. And I know it's easy to say that, but there is a truth to it. It is your passion which is the most, rewarding aspect of being alive, and that passion can shift. It ain't the same as making a living, but he's still working as a as a lawyer, and I'm on occasion doing commercials. So question.
Did you choose to be a criminal lawyer for inspiration, or was it strictly just for the money? Or what? Yeah. What was
When I made the decision to go to law school, I was a writing fellow, I then taught at Stanford. I was headed for an academic life and realizing slowly that this was not for me. I just, it's a great thing to be a university professor. It wasn't going to float my boat. What I was really interested in were the stories of the friends I was making in San Francisco who were criminal lawyers. And one of my buddies from college was becoming a prosecutor up in Seattle. And I was just always drawn to that. By the time I was in my third year in law school, I was trying cases in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. That's where a lot of the setting for presumed innocent came from, as my experiences in the Boston DA's office, and I was lucky enough to get a job as an assistant United States attorney. At that point, I had published 1L, but no novels, and I was drawn to the criminal law because I find it amazing. Criminality is one of the great is one of the great forums for human imagination. We don't tend to recognize it as such, but this kind of transgressive behavior is always illuminating. It's of course makes us furious at times, but there's that old thing about the cops. If if the wind had blown a different way with many of them, they'd be on the other side of the law. We're all drawn to some degree to an interest in criminality, and I was drawn more than some degree. Well, it's the old saw. It's what I know. I've been in that world professionally and haven't left it since 1978. So, and it's just you look at somebody like Rod Blagojevich, who's in my humble opinion, a major sociopath. But
look at that hair.
That's right, It's a hairdo where you don't know if he's coming or going. The Lady Gaga of American politics. Anyway, but he's fascinating. He's fascinating. One of my friends from the U.S. Attorney's Office was involved in the case. He says, you think you've seen everything, and then you sit there and listen to these tapes, and it is really fascinating, both how the law defines and deals with evil and the forces that lead people to.
How would you define sociopath?
How would I define sociopath? I really think that Rod Blagojevich does not know what the truth is. It would have been a great defense if he'd allowed his lawyers to put it forth, but, he's much too narcissistic to allow that.
So you rewrite your own truth.
There
was a lady here who wanted to ask a question.
what is the process like for you in terms of determining what you're going to write your next book on? And also, once you've decided on that, how do you go about in actually writing? Do you set aside a time, for example, in the morning, in the afternoon? How do you do that? How do you do it?
Well, I am in one of those periods where I don't know what I'm going to do next. I thought I knew, and then I began to realize that what I had begun working on probably wasn't a good idea for me for many reasons, just mostly because it really wouldn't sustain the amount of attention that a novel requires. You know, my friend Amy Tan says it's not a matter of having a good idea, it's a matter of having a good idea you can live with.
For how long?
You know, for often years at a time. So at this stage, I have enough faith in myself, and I've been through this enough to know that something will emerge, and probably, in the fall when the weather turns, and I have to go back inside anyway. So when that happens, there will be something that reverberates for me. I mean, and there's all kinds of things going through my head now. I've always promised my son that I would write a novel set in the future, and I'm actually thinking about that. People keep pestering me and asking, are you going to write, yet another sequel? Are you going to write a sequel to Innocent? And I have an idea for what I think would be an interesting slice on that. So the truth of the matter is that what I'm going to end up writing about is probably already circulating in my brain. I just don't know which of those things is going to accrete in that way that has the kind of emotional resonance that it has to have.
You mentioned that you woke up or whatever one morning and you saw this image. It was from Hopper, you later realized, but it was a man sitting on the bed and his wife is lying next to him and she's dead. And that was the beginning.
Right.
What is the ratio of those kind of random thoughts, if you will, that wind up being novels?
I think it's, who knows? Maybe it's 1 in 20. I left that Post-it note on my desk for months, and then I had it's a long story, but I'd begun thinking about Rusty Sabich again, but I was going to use him in another story. And my agent wasn't keen on that idea, and she had good reasons not to be. And all of a sudden, I turned around and I looked at the Post-it note, and I said, that's the man who's sitting on the bed. Rusty Sabich is the man who's sitting on the bed. And that's like, okay, well then, who's the woman? And immediately, I decided it had to be Barbara, the wife from Presumed Innocent. I didn't figure out why, although I look back and know that for readers of Presumed Innocent, there would be a certain justness in knowing that Barbara was dead at the beginning of this book. But then the big question is, well, what are they doing together in a bed? Is this some kind of, amorous reunion? And then it's like, wait a minute, are they still married? Could they actually still be married? And I went and looked at the end of Presumed Innocent, where Rusty, in point of fact, is already talking about reconciling with Barbara. And I realized they're still married. And there's the novel. Right there. There is the novel.
Do you have to outline the narrative? Do you have to kind of know the end in order to start at the beginning? Or do you subscribe to the notion that at a certain point the characters take over, or even the narrative takes over?
Well, I write in especially at first, in a very experimental way. I don't spend a lot of time just thinking. I get up every morning and I write. I'll do character backgrounds, I'll see certain scenes, maybe there's a building I want to describe, but I keep writing.
And how long during a day?
That process usually ends up being a year.
No, I mean in a day. How many?
Frankly, at that stage, as long as I can keep my behind in the chair, because I think, it is important to write. And, in the beginning, when there's no mass and thus no gravity to hold you there, the natural impulse is to get up and, as Rick Russo says, stick your head in the refrigerator. Because, Russo's line that I always repeat is, every writer has the same experience of finding his head in the refrigerator and wondering, what am I doing here? And the answer is because it's the furthest point in the house from your computer. So I try to keep myself working.
Do you wake up the next morning and reread it and say, this is shit, and throw it away?
When I'm stuck, I do reread. I don't
that's not to.
I don't ever throw it away. Sometimes I'll reread it and go, okay, I'm going to do it again. Sometimes I just leave it there with the thought that, well, I wrote it for some reason, and maybe I can come around at it again at another time in the future. It's not a very efficient way to write.
It's a miserable existence in some ways, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if I've ever met a writer that says, I love writing. I get up every morning and I write.
I have
all
to
day."
tell you the truth. You're probably looking at one who says he loves writing. I regard it as an enormous privilege. And yes, the beginning stages are sometimes painful. You're full of doubt. Is this ever going to come to anything? You're wasting your time. This is terrible. You could be doing something, profitable. You can go get a, new pro bono case. Why are you sitting here doing this? But when it really starts to come together, it's a great high. And I think being a writer is a great gig. I really do. I'm grateful every day when I'm sitting in front of that computer.
This man with the baseball hat and the beard wanted to ask a question, I think.
First of all, just want to, I think, speak for a lot of people here. We're just very happy to have you here, Scott and Dustin, for doing this. It's great to hear.